before Easter, we were working through a series of homilies on how to evaluate moral questions. So just as a refresher, we evaluate moral questions based off of three things: the object, intention, and circumstance. Object, meaning the action taken itself. Intention, meaning the motivation for the action. And circumstance, all the other factors that can play into a moral choice: where, when, how, whom, to whom. And we've already covered intention and circumstance in previous talks, and we're in the midst of a lengthy discussion on the object, the what of the actions. Which actions can we deem morally acceptable and morally unacceptable? So this is obviously, as I've said months ago now at this point, that we base morality off of natural law and divine revelation. And so we look at those things when evaluating moral actions. We first looked at evaluating good and evil actions based off of the 7 deadly sins. And now we're going to be doing the same, but we're going to base it off of the 10 Commandments, which is by far the more common way of evaluating choices. Today we're going to be talking about the First Commandment, which is this. It's longer than you think it is. The First Commandment is, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth below, or that is under the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. And then Jesus comments on this first commandment when he says, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. A thing that often gets missed with this first commandment, we generally tend to simplify it to, don't worship other gods. But I'm going to be talking for about 20 minutes to tell you that it's more than that. So the thing that gets missed is that this first commandment is based not on God demanding that we serve him, but rather it's a logical, appropriate response to God and to God's love. God reminds us, this first commandment is like 4 verses long. God reminds us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt. He frees us from slavery of sin. He is always faithful. He is always just. And the correct response to that kind of love is to accept his words and to have faith in him and to acknowledge his authority over all other powers on earth. And so he gives us this first commandment. He is almighty, he is merciful, and he is infinitely good. What other things should we do other than worship him alone? If we do reject him, it's almost certainly because we don't know him. St. Paul says that ignorance of God is basically the underlying explanation of all morality, of all morally evil decisions. You can think of it as a relative that it's a distant relative. You don't truly get to know them. It probably also means that you never truly got the opportunity to really love them, at least as close as people can love. At least compared to someone else who knew and cared for that person, who spent hours and days taking care of them in their old age or being at the foot of their hospital bed. When you go to the funeral for that kind of a distant relative, it might just feel like any other funeral. But for somebody else, that caretaker, their entire world has been changed. And it's the same with God. If we fail to know him, then we'll fail to truly love him intimately. I think often of all the people that never came back to church after the COVID-19 lockdown. Did they truly know God? I'm not passing judgment or anything, but my heart breaks for them if that's the case. And that's why the first commandment's in place. It helps us to nourish and to protect our faith with prudence and vigilance. Vigilance is important, upkeeping that relationship, and to reject everything that's opposed to that relationship. So there's several parts to this first commandment, and as I said, it's like 4 verses long. Exodus 20, verses 2 through 5. The first, God says, you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, we are called to love God above everything else, and the things that we do love, we only love because God has given them to us. We recognize God's goodness in them. So what are some attitudes that are contrary to that type of love? Indifference, where we fail to reflect on God's love. in gratitude, where we fail to acknowledge and to return that love. Lukewarmness, where we hesitate or neglect to respond to God's love. We can be lazy, spiritually slothful. Talked about one of the deadly sins of sloth. And on the extreme end, you can go all the way to hatred of God, which is rooted in pride. But a love for God requires the correct response on our part. So what's the correct response look like to the First Commandment? We often think of the things that we don't do right, but what are some of the things that we should be doing right? The first response to God, based on the First Commandment, is adoration. The Catechism says, adoration is the first act of the virtue of religion. To adore God is to acknowledge him as God, as the Creator and Savior, the Lord and Master of everything that exists, as infinite and merciful love. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve, says Jesus, citing the book of Deuteronomy. So this necessarily means humbling ourselves before him. Adoration. When we worship him, it prevents us from turning in on ourselves, and it prevents us from self-worship. When we come to church, are we coming to adore God? Or are we coming for another reason? Are we coming to humble ourselves before his goodness? Or are we coming to hear, some nice words? Hopefully Father won't be too boring this week, and sing some nice songs. Or maybe we're coming to receive communion because it fuels you throughout the week. Or do we come to church to be a part of a community? Are we coming to church because it's an obligation and somebody's going to notice when you're not there? If adoring God is not our primary purpose for being here, then we've started on the wrong foot. And if our purpose in being here isn't rooted in adoration, then our faith can be eroded rather quickly. Kind of like those people that never came back after COVID. The second appropriate response to God's love is prayer, which kind of follows from adoration. Adoration, in fact, is a type of prayer. So prayer is lifting up our mind to God. There's 4 types of prayer. I've talked about this before, but adoration, where we acknowledge God's greatness and goodness. Contrition, where we confess our sins out of love for God. Thanksgiving, where we acknowledge the gift that God has given us in all of their fine details. And then finally, supplication, where we make intercession for others with our own personal prayer intentions. Prayer is necessary for being able to live God's commandments. If we don't self-reflect, then we're never going to be able to evaluate whether or not we're living by the commandments. If we're not in the habit of praying, then we're not in the habit of acknowledging God's role and presence in our lives. The third appropriate response to God's love is sacrifice. The prophets of the Old Testament preached against sacrifices that were not from the heart or coupled with love of neighbor. And Jesus recites the words of the prophet Hosea when he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The mercy is the important part. And of course, the only perfect sacrifice is the one that Jesus offered for our sins on the cross. So when we come to Mass, we are uniting ourselves to that sacrifice. And we can make our lives a sacrifice because of that. So adoration, prayer, sacrifice, and the fourth appropriate response to God's love is promises that we make. We make promises to God more often than we realize, especially in the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, holy matrimony, holy orders. Those all involve promises that we make before God and to God. Those are the most serious promises that we can make. We can make smaller promises too, out of personal devotion, some goal that you want to set. We do it all the time during Lent, of course. Spiritual goals. Being faithful to promises made to God is a sign that we recognize his love. The vows that you made to your spouse on your wedding day weren't just made to your spouse, they were also made to God. I'll be faithful to you until death. The promises that were made on your behalf by your parents or your godparents at your baptism, they're ways that demonstrate our love for God. Do you reject Satan? It's the first commandment. The final approach to God's love is that we serve as an example in order to call others to God. So if we truly believe in God, then we're going to be willing to share in that belief with others by teaching and evangelizing. And in so doing, the church works toward changing the culture and changing society. If we find ourselves complaining about the state of the world, we need to start by looking in the mirror and seeing what we've done to further God's kingdom. The Catechism says this: the social duty of Christians is to respect and awaken in each person the love of the true and the good. It requires them, Catechism says, you are required to make known the worship of the one true religion which subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Christians are called to be the light of the world. And this goes back to the natural law, actually, because our very nature, the way that God made us, enables us to freely assent to the truth. And when we're presented with the truth, we want to share that truth with others. So those are the appropriate responses to God's love. Those are the appropriate responses to the First Commandment. What are the things that the First Commandment forbids us to do? Well, first, most obvious thing, don't worship false gods. It's pretty straightforward. The thing, though, is that we're not, talking about worshiping Zeus or Poseidon. I mean, I guess it includes that, but we can make anything, practically anything, our God. We commit idolatry whenever we honor something that is created in place of God. It could be other gods or demons. It could also be a desire for power or comfort or pleasure or ancestors or politics. We could worship money or TV or sports or food or sex or looks or popularity. We could worship social media or alcohol. What do we give our total lives to? What are we willing to give our life for? It is a noble thing to be willing to die for the love of another, but we can also be willing to die for material things too. Just ask an addict. Now, this doesn't mean that we gauge the First Commandment, whether or not we're living right by the amount of time that we spend on things. For example, I spend a lot more time working behind a computer than I do praying. But this doesn't mean that I'm breaking the First Commandment by doing that. Work takes time. That's just how the world is. But what does matter is the why. Is what I'm doing now bringing me closer to God or farther away from God? And there's some things that are neutral, like watching a Husker football game, unless it causes you to be angry and unpleasant, which is usually the case. But so we can enjoy certain things, but if they dominate our life, then you've given yourself over to a false god. All right, the First Commandment also forbids superstition. So if your faith is in doing the thing rather than the underlying truth behind the thing, that's a superstition. For example, if you recite the Divine Mercy Chaplet, because in her diary, St. Faustina says that Jesus says, whoever recites this chaplet at 3 o'clock, he's going to give you whatever you ask for in prayer. If that's the reason that you pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, then that's a superstition. Jesus isn't a genie in a bottle, and this isn't magic. What makes prayer work, and this is evident from the Gospels, is our faith. That's what makes prayer effective, the belief behind it. It is the God that you are praying to. Prayer demands an interior disposition as well as an exterior one. So superstition breaks the First Commandment. The First Commandment also forbids divination, which is, attempting by some unnatural means to know or see future events or to gain power of some sort. And while God can, and in fact does, reveal the future to like the prophets in the Old Testament or to saints, nowadays all through the history of the church, it's not our place to demand knowledge of those things or to pursue that kind of knowledge. Rather, we need to simply place our trust in what God has planned for us. And so this precludes things like, invoking spirits or conjuring up the dead with something like a Ouija board or a seance, or basing your life on horoscopes or astrology or palm reading or tea leaf reading or going to psychic mediums. All of these things indicate that we have a desire for power over our future, which power over time, which only belongs to God. And a lot of you probably think all the things that I listed are rather silly, but I assure you witchcraft and occultism is the fastest growing religion on planet Earth right now. So that's that one, divination. The first commandment also prohibits what is called, quote unquote, tempting God. This is basically where you make a deal with God. God, if you do this, I'll do this for you. This attitude indicates that we don't really respect God and we don't really, trust in his plan for us. The first commandment also forbids sacrilege, which is abusing or disrespecting the sacraments, as well as persons, things, or places that are consecrated to God for religious purposes. So sacrilege is usually associated with desecration of a church or the desecration of the Eucharist. Some sacrilege is worse than others. It can range from receiving communion when you have a mortal sin on your soul without going to confession, all the way to, stealing and using a Eucharistic host in a satanic ritual. Those are both sacrilege. That's how seriously we take it. The first commandment also prohibits simony. Simony is the buying or selling of spiritual things. And this comes from the Acts of the Apostles. It's called simony because Simon the magician is the name that the Bible gives us. He approaches the apostles and he wants to buy some of their spiritual power. And Peter responds by saying, "Your silver will perish with you because you thought that you could obtain God's gift with money." And I believe immediately after that, Simon falls down dead. So we can never hold the sacraments or the gifts of God behind a paywall. There are certain costs for things, of course, like the upkeep of buildings and paying employees' salaries. But we're never going to make the faith a pay-to-play scenario. So simony is forbidden by the first commandment. An obvious prohibition of the first commandment is atheism. People use the word atheism to describe any number of attitudes and philosophies. One form of atheism, and this is probably the most common form, is called a practical atheism. And this is the idea that all of existence is completely and only material. The only things that are worth thinking about are things that can be measured and proven and disproven by science. So that's practical atheism, or materialism, as the church would call it. Another form of atheism is atheistic humanism, which falsely believes that the human beings are the greatest achievement of our own design, that we are the makers of our own destiny, that we have control over the world and its history, rather than the God of history. Another form of contemporary atheism is found in modern political systems, such as Marxism and many forms of socialism and communism. And this atheism looks for the liberation of humanity through political and economic and social means. This is the idea that certain political systems can and will achieve some form of paradise on earth. And I can't think of anything more depressing than looking for the meaning of life in politics. Another attitude that is prohibited by the first commandment is called agnosticism. Agnosticism is that the view that God is impersonable and unknowable. He's distant. He created the universe, but really has nothing to do with it on a day-to-day basis. Or agnosticism could also mean that, well, it's impossible to know if God exists or what he's like. Sometimes agnosticism can include a search for God. Somebody can be agnostic but still pursuing God in some way. But most of the time, it essentially is an avoidance of God, and it's basically practically the same as atheism. Many people use agnosticism as sort of this excuse to stop their pursuit of the divine. Well, we really can't know him, so why bother, type of thing. All right, so those are the things that are prohibited. The last thing that the first commandment ends with is, it says, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth below, or that is under the earth, or under the water under the earth." And this is our non-Catholic friends' way of, they stick this to the Catholics, saying, you guys have statues, paintings, you're worshiping images. And in fact, for most non-Catholics, I think the King James Version of the Bible, it actually has this as a separate commandment, other than having it lumped in with the first one. So the "you shall not make graven images" is their second commandment. And they combine the last two, the 9th and the 10th. Well, we keep those separate. But anyways, the truth is that already in the Old Testament, God is instructing the Israelites to make images of certain things, so it's not completely forbidden. What the commandment is talking about is worshiping those things. So God allowed the making of symbolic images frequently in the Old Testament. The whole temple area is filled with decorations. The story of Moses making the bronze serpent in the desert for the people to look upon and be healed of their snake bites. The Ark of the Covenant was a thing that was graven. The cherubim sat on the lid to the Ark of the Covenant. Those were physical figures. And these were all foreshadowings of what would happen later, that God himself would take on a physical, visible form. Jesus Christ becomes the image of God himself. And so the veneration of images is not contrary to the First Commandment, which forbids the use and the worship of idols. The honor that we pay to sacred images is sort of a respectful veneration. It's not the same adoration that we would give to God, for example. The image is there to take us spiritually toward the real thing represented by the image, not the image itself. We don't stop at the painting or the statue, we go beyond it. It's merely a physical representation of the truth that leads us closer to God. And religious art elevates our minds and our hearts toward him. The physical sign reveals God to us, just as, in the gospel that we just heard, where Jesus is revealed to the two disciples in the breaking of the bread. What would our non-Catholic friends say about that? Was the bread a graven image when they recognized Jesus? All of this entire First Commandment, can be summarized by the words of Jesus, Matthew 6:24, when he says, "You cannot serve both God and mammon." Mammon meaning material things, things created, things that are not God. You can't serve both God and material things. You can't serve both God and yourself. You can't even serve your spouse without first serving God. Every good thing we seek, material things, our feelings, our accomplishments, our relationships, these are meant to lead us to him, and if they don't, then they're leading us away from him, and that goes against the First Commandment. So that's the First Commandment. Hopefully the other ones will go quicker. We'll get through more than one in a weekend. But we're going to end each of the 10 Commandments with sort of a bullet point checklist that serves as an examination of conscience. We can answer each of the following questions. Do I give God time every day in prayer? Do I seek to love him with my whole heart? Do I seek to surrender myself to God's word as taught by the church? Have I ever received communion in a state of mortal sin? Have I ever deliberately told a lie in confession, or have I withheld a mortal sin from the priest in confession? Have I disobeyed the commandments of God or the church? Have I denied the existence of God? Have I nourished and protected my faith with prayer and adoration? Have I rejected everything opposed to a sound faith? Have I deliberately misled others about doctrine of the faith? Have I despaired about my salvation or the forgiveness of my sins? Have I loved someone or something more than God, such as money, power, sex, ambition, etc.? Have I let someone or something influence my choices more than God? Have I engaged in superstitious or occult practices such as horoscopes, fortune tellers, seances, Ouija boards, or the worship of Satan?